Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So welcome to the third Cyprus Forum and the panel on the negotiation design. My name is. Can you please have a seat so that we can get started? Thank you. So my name is Aristotelis Constantinides. I'm an associate professor of international law and human rights, and I will be the moderator of this panel. My special thanks to the organizers for inviting me. In this panel, we are having 6 speakers, so not 7. The Greek Cypriot negotiator, Mr. Menelos Menelaou, unfortunately will not be able to join us today, and he apologizes for that. The reason is the sensitive stage of the process. So we are having 6 speakers, 4 on-site and 2 online. And we have decided to divide this panel in 2 sets of questions. We only have 60 minutes and we've got 6 speakers. So without any further ado, I will set the first question to all speakers and we'll give them a maximum of 4 minutes to give their responses. And so the first question is talking about the design of the negotiations. What were the strong points, the strong aspects, and what were the weak aspects of the negotiation process so far? And in the event of a future negotiation process, what could or should change and be improved? So I will first give the floor to Ms. Erato Kozakou-Marcoullis. I'm not going to introduce the speakers other by their names because they are all very well known, and you all, of course, you can have their CVs online. So, yes, Ms.
Thank you very
Marcoullis.
much, Aris. Let us remind ourselves first of certain facts. Nearly 60 years have elapsed since the UN, the international community, has been dealing with the problem. 7 secretaries general and 27 mediators, special advisors, special representatives have also assisted in these efforts. So far, during the 60 years, many ideas, many plans, many frameworks, many proposals have been put forward. Unfortunately, none of these efforts has been conclusive, and we have not had any final results. And now, currently, we are going through the worst and the longest ever deadlock in all the processes of negotiations. Now, I will mention certain facts that I consider that have been negative throughout these processes. Let me say that I believe that the negotiations, the processes that have been employed so far have failed for a number of reasons, and I will mention some of these reasons. The fact that the negotiations, the way they have been conducted so far, have been conducted between the leaders. And of course, you know that all the leaders so far have been men. They have been conducted also between negotiators over the years, and all negotiators have been men. And these leaders and negotiators have been assisted by an elite group of experts, mostly men. Why do I mention this? Because I want to go to the second factor, which is that women, especially during the first, let's say, 40 years, have been totally absent from the negotiating process. And in most recent years, there has been some limited participation of women in the negotiations. And this is a very negative factor. Political will now. Political will of the leaders has been lacking. one leader at a time during these processes, so that it has been either limited or lacking, and this has been one of the other factors that these processes have failed. The civil society also has been totally absent throughout these 60 years, totally absent, no mechanism to include civil society in these negotiations. And also the negotiating process has not been transparent. There has been secrecy. The Secretary General mentioned in one of his reports that we do have to tackle this problem of secrecy. We have to find a way to inform people, a process to inform people about the outcome of the different negotiating stages. And another factor is that we have to inform people, and people have been informed in a very limited way about federation. We have been, at least in the past, all talking about the federal system. I think that most people on both sides have not been aware of what is a federation, how it works, and how it functions. And finally, the media throughout these 60 years, I think they have played a very, very negative role in projecting or non-projecting or misprojecting the different outcomes of the negotiations. Now, what we have to do if we start again negotiations, how can we improve? The first I would like to propose is to have a precise agenda, and also to commit that the leaders should commit that they will not open any agreed convergences. No opening of agreed convergences. Second, the Guterres framework, we have to finalize, we have to move forward based on the Guterres framework in order to agree on a strategic agreement within a set timeline. Now, regarding timelines and deadlines and time pressure, you know that this issue is very controversial. There are the pros and the cons of putting pressure. This is the so-called deadline diplomacy. If we are going to put any deadlines for the conclusion of the negotiations, we have to be very careful. We have to put safeguards. And also we have to have a methodology in place which will use sticks and carrots. Sticks for those who are not behaving well, and carrots for those who are cooperating and they want a solution. Then we have to agree on a set of immediately implementable CBMs in order to improve the climate. Because one of the reasons I didn't mention is the lack of a good climate prevailing between the public. De-escalate the language throughout the process, the public speaking. The confidentiality issue is a very important issue, and I think that joint statements should be agreed. So the leaders or the negotiators or spokesmen of the two sides should not go separately to the media. They should agree on specific agreed joint statements to give out to the media, and those who will give it out would be the UN throughout the process, so that we don't repeat ourselves in these negative scenarios that we have seen during other processes. We have to explain also constantly the benefits of a solution to the people. The issue of women, definitely more women, or I would say that more than 30% women should be included in the delegations, and gender experts also to be included in order to inject the gender perspective in the negotiations. And finally, the civil society has to be engaged if we want the civil society to be informed, if we want them at the outcome of the negotiations to vote in referenda. They have to be engaged from the beginning. So we have to find a way, as in other negotiating processes. For example, in South Africa, trade unions and other organizations were part of the negotiating process, so that civil society will be informed and they will be engaged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Marcoullis. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Ozdil Nami, Turkish Cypriot, very well-known Turkish Cypriot retired politician, for his for his still here.
First of all, to the organizers for this very important event, and for all those who took the time to come and listen. I'll try to be very brief. You asked two specific questions: what worked and what didn't, and then we will discuss what can be done. In my experience, and I served as negotiator under two Turkish Cypriot leaders, with Mr. Talat and with Mr. Akıncı. In both cases, what worked was we had a big problem and we divided into smaller parts. So that was a good idea. Second, we got very good people to work with us, real experts. Erato called them elites. And in my team, to my advantage, my elite consisted mostly of women, some of whom are here, and I appreciated their help a lot. Thirdly, leaders who wanted a solution. That helps a lot. And they were leading people, they were creating a positive energy. I remember the time when Akıncı and Anastasiades went to Büyükhan, and then we visited the cafe shops in the Greek Cypriot side. So there was this very positive energy, which helps a lot. And puts some control over the media. This all negative messaging of the media is put under check when you have the people behind this process supported by strong leadership. What also worked was the way in which we included the European Union. Maybe Kjartan will also dwell on that. And that sort of maybe assured the Greek Cypriot community that what we were doing was going to be in line with the EU acquis, and was something that could be accommodated by the European Union. But on our side as well, the very fact that we were there to look after our own interests, meaning that once we are in the EU together, we would not be just disappearing in the big pool, was also very good. It was not easy to design all of this, but once they were in place, these were helpful. What was difficult was, of course, to settle everything on its own merit. When you are negotiating, especially regarding a problem like the Cyprus issue, everything touches upon another topic. So you can't really finish the property issue without really finalizing the governance issue. You can't finalize the territory issue without saying something on the security and guarantees issue. But this was well understood. That's why in every chapter we decided from earlier on that we would leave some things for the big grand give and take. So that was also something that was helpful, that by the very design of the negotiation process, it was agreed that we won't agree on everything and then move to another chapter. It would be okay to leave something out there for the final big give and take. And the very fact that we went to the Cyprus conference in Crans-Montana, where, in the words of Secretary General, the solution was on the table, demonstrates that what we designed was good up until that point. It worked. And maybe some of the issues that Erato addressed was different on our side, because we did consult with the NGOs. We tried to involve them. We had periodic meetings with our NGOs. So if we were going to take a step on the property issue, we would invite the industry leaders and have deep discussions with them. Or if it was something related to trade and economy, our chambers of commerce would be invited. So there was some constant dialogue in our case. But what we were not anticipating was the problems we would face at the final leg of the talks, which took place in Crans-Montana. And that was a sudden disappearance of political will. For that, we didn't account for it. So the design was good for the technical aspects of solving the technical aspects of the Cyprus issue, but it lacked the dimension of what happens if political will changes. And maybe in the second round, we can dwell a little bit more on that and how we can take measures in the event that if and when negotiations resume and we come to that final stage, how do we take an insurance against such a development that we confronted in Crans-Montana?
Same question now. The floor is Ahmet. Sozen.
Thank you, Ari. The intercommunal negotiations started the year I was born. And I'm not a young man anymore, as you can see. Look, I don't think that there is a ready-made dress for Cyprus problem. I think different periods need to be addressed differently. And the formula is balancing both internal dynamics with the external dynamics, creating that synergy if you want to solve the problem. And of course, as was mentioned before, having two leaders who have the genuine desire to solve the Cyprus problem and having mutually agreed vision would definitely help. But unfortunately, that has not been the case in the last 35 years, no, 55 years. This is when the intercommunal negotiations are. But let me touch upon 4 areas in 3 minutes where I see weaknesses, at the same time strengths, but depends on how you look at it. One is, everything was mentioned, by the way. One is that the intercommunal negotiations has always been track one oriented, totally cut off from the rest of the other tracks or other parts of the society. So the input from the stakeholders is not really there. Well, during some negotiations, during some leadership, they consulted with civil society and the other stakeholders more than the others. So it has not been homogeneous throughout the last 50-something years. And you know, being track one is a good thing, is a strength, because at the end of the day, if two leaders agree, then that's a very powerful thing for the agreement to live. But the lack of an inclusive process itself is also problematic, because it raises issues on legitimacy and of the whole thing, whether it is democratic or not. So it depends on how you look at it. That's the number one thing. And that within that, the negotiations were not fed by research-based information, where, you know, the sides can also see what kind of win-win sets they can get. For example, polling on important negotiation issues, which used to be the case in early 2010s, but unfortunately afterwards that has not been the case. Northern Ireland is a good example where we can learn a lot how those scientific-based information can be plugged in there. So mostly remains dry and monotonous and mostly positional bargaining. Now, the second thing is, again, mentioned, the negotiations depend on this notion called nothing is agreed unless we agree on everything. That's a good thing, maybe, that is open for give and take, but nonetheless, it doesn't have any binding threats on the side, so they can actually dodge it anytime they want. Okay, I know that my time is running, so I'm going to be fast. Number three is the UN's mission in Cyprus is very limited. Mission of good offices, which is less than mediation. It's like taking notes, providing the venue and the crappy coffee with big mugs. And I'm sorry about that, but you know what I mean. And then the last thing is that this process, the track one, lacks what is essential, in my opinion, a second track, which is based on continuous confidence building measures between the two sides. Because we need that in order to build this cooperation culture and experience in our island. And that is totally missing in the process. How do we get these things right? Well, do the opposite of what has been done so far. And I'll, in the second hour, I can talk about what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmet, also for keeping the time indicated. And now, same questions, but probably from the viewpoint of the European Commission to Kjartan Björnsson, Deputy Director and Head of Unit of the European Commission's Directorate General for Structural Reform Support.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a little bit of complication, I think, to be the last one, but maybe also easier because I can just agree with all the good parts and then we leave it at that. But of course, the difficulty is how do you add something in addition to the good words. Now, I would generally say I agree with many of the things that have been said by all three of you, and I would focus on one aspect, which is the lack of a reunification climate. You used it in different terms, but you all referred to this. I think, in our view, Cypriots they must very concretely, very specifically experience the benefits of reunification and therefore full membership for Turkish Cypriots across the island, and they need to benefit them immediately. It can't be something that eventually you will have a nirvana of opportunities. We believe that if we have such an approach, we would facilitate the resumption of negotiations. We would increase the chances of an agreement in the sense that leaders would not be as fearful, I think, to face a hostile public. And I think, therefore, also it would be more likely that agreements would be then carried in the public referenda that would follow. So I think one of the most effective measures to get buy-in would specifically be to offer to Turkish Cypriots some specific benefits already now. So benefits that would come with a price. So in our view, they would be able to get a little bit of a taste of EU membership in return for complying with EU standards now. So not upon settlement, but now. And I think we can do that safely. We have different views possibly here in terms of status, but we believe that it will be possible to do this without compromising red lines and views on status. So what we are talking about is something that will benefit ordinary Turkish Cypriots directly and immediately, and build this sort of concrete experience of what does it involve in practice. Now, you could say this is very far-fetched, and I would say, well, we actually have done it. And some of you will know that I'm a little bit obsessed with your fantastic cheese, halloumi hilim, and it's true I've become a fanatic about it. But more seriously, this is actually doing exactly what I just said. We have de facto, not de jure, but we have de facto lifted the acquis suspension in a small area of the acquis regarding this famous cheese, so that Turkish Cypriots can benefit from the registration, so the intellectual property right. they will be able to sell this cheese in the EU market across the Green Line, provided that they comply with the same standards that others are. So we have created what we call a mini reunification lab. Now, we believe that it works for a number of reasons, one of which is that we see that the Turkish Cypriots are embracing the requirements. They are actually doing very difficult choices in order to be compliant, which is very positive. And they do this because they can see the economic benefits. And I believe that unless you can feel these economic benefits at all levels in the two communities, but in this case, the Turkish Cypriot community, then it will be very difficult to sell whatever solution that the leaders can come up with. So I'll leave it at that and can come back in the second part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kjartan. And we will now move to our two online distinguished colleagues. Anyone can see them? Yes. The question to them is slightly different, so they are not required, unless they want, of course, to comment on the Cyprus negotiation peace process, but we would particularly like to benefit from their very rich experience from a comparative perspective. So we are really privileged to have with us Mr. Sergio Jaramillo Caro, or Sergio Jaramillo Caro, the former High Commissioner for Peace in Colombia, joining us online from Colombia, and Professor Marie-Joelle Zahar, joining us online from Montreal. Thank you very much, both, for your e-presence. So the question to you is slightly different. Are there any common features in the design of successful negotiations in divided societies? Marie-Joelle, you have the floor first.
Thank you for the invitation, and really sorry not to be able to be joining you in presence. I will agree with a lot of what has been said, which echoes what tends to work well in other places. But let me start by saying that, as was highlighted by some of my co-panelists, mediation is both part art and part science. And the best process in the world cannot completely guarantee success, which I think should get us to pause about our definitions of success. We tend to define success simply as signing an agreement. But in fact, there are a number of things that happen in a negotiation, as the former Turkish negotiator highlighted, Turkish separate negotiator highlighted, that are actually positive and that need to be shared, because in many ways, what we have is often, part successes and part failures. Now, having said that, I would agree that particularly in cases like Cyprus, and unfortunately, you are in good company, many conflicts last 50 plus years without resolution. There are a number of things that are important to think about processes where there has been a number of previous experiences defined as failures. And again, I put failures between brackets. And I'm thinking of places like Mali, the Central African Republic, even more recently, a younger conflict, but a complicated one, places like Syria, where you've had people at the table time and again, but there's not really been visible progress. And I think that in those places, as was highlighted, confidence building measures are really important. And confidence building measures can be measures that are offered by the parties to one another, but also, like our EU colleague highlighted, when the parties are not necessarily in a position to do that, they can come from third parties supporting the process. In a place like Mali, Algeria was the one that was able to actually get a confidence building measure towards the armed groups by securing the release of hostages. Now, this is not at all the situation in Cyprus, but it speaks to the fact that outside friends of a process can actually help ease the bumps. Agreement on basic rules of the game. how the process is going to happen, but also what happens if parties respect or do not respect their commitments. What happens if parties use language that has not been agreed upon, or actually that has been publicly decided to be unacceptable by the parties in the context of the process? What happens if the parties decide, to speak to the media when in fact they may have agreed to give discussion of the process to a mediator or to a third party so that they are not involved? When there are no consequences, it becomes easy to actually violate the rules. And in all the negotiations that I have supported in my limited experience compared to those of you who've been dealing with Cyprus for such a long time, when there are basic rules of the game negotiated even before the mediation starts, that puts the mediation on more firm grounding. I will also say that, in fact, inclusion, which was highlighted, is an essential element. Everywhere I've worked, the decision not to include civil society, women, youth, business communities has had detrimental effects where they've been included and consulted. And I don't mean necessarily by giving them a seat at the table. And I think we need to get away from the notion of a table, because then it becomes too unmanageable to have everyone around the table. But to find, ways of consulting in a regular way with those who are the primary concerned parties, because they're going to live with the agreement, is essential. And then finally, I think that in my experience, it is those processes that focus not simply on what's going to be on paper, but also on setting up solid mechanisms for implementation and mechanisms for sorting out the troubles that will happen after an agreement is signed, that have the best chance of success. And here, I think this is maybe a good time to hand it over to Sergio, because in many ways, Colombia could be presented as one of the better cases thinking through some of these issues and putting them in practice. Although, of course, I know Sergio is going to say that Colombia was not perfect.
Marie-Joelle, and of course, thank you also for helping me with giving the floor to Sergio. We look forward to your very rich experience in the Colombian context.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really very sad not to be there. I had a wonderful time when I was there last October and gave a little talk on Nicosia, and I've been trying to think a little bit about this. I do feel very weary about saying anything because Cyprus is a very sophisticated place. We've been negotiating for a long time. There's probably nothing at all new we can tell you. On the other hand, my own private joke is that the one thing that all conflicts have in common is that they all think they're unique. And I think one can, with a little bit of humility, one can learn from others. At least that's what we try to do ourselves in Colombia. Actually, the main message I have for Cyprus is that it is actually possible to solve a very, very long conflict. We were in a situation which is not unlike yours, at least in terms of the length of the conflict. If you had actually wrapped it up at the negotiation in Montana, it would have been almost exactly as long as the Colombian conflict. We had done the same thing of going through waves and waves of failed negotiations, which are very depressing. And I always say one has to be careful to start a negotiation because people grow tired. But it is possible, and in my own very simple view, you need two things. You need to try and work on creating favorable conditions, and you need to structure a proper process. And I'll say now a few points about that, and then I'll keep some for the second part. I'll make 3 quick points, all very obvious and mostly already mentioned. Well, let's start with the most obvious one, which is the one about leadership. Leaders and leadership are no guarantee that you're going to strike a peace agreement. But what it is clear is that if you don't have that, you're not going to get a peace agreement. It is impossible because it is so hard. It's so hard that unless the leader is completely invested in this, is not going to happen. And you see that everywhere, really. In our case, was President Santos, who took huge risks. If you go to Northern Ireland, anybody who knows the story knows that Tony Blair was really on top of this, to the extent of really being up at 5 in the morning on the famous Friday morning of the Good Friday Agreement, as was Bertie Ahern from Ireland, as were indeed the most important players, who were the political parties, Trimble and company, and Sinn Féin. So unless the leaders are invested, it's not going to happen. And that is, to me, absolutely necessary precondition. No amount of intelligence and process design is going to solve the problem of leadership. You do need to structure a process carefully. We did that. We worked very hard on that on Colombia. And the one lesson I've taken away myself, something that really worked for us, and curiously, when I've looked at other places, and we did actually look at other places at the time, I find parallels both with the case of Northern Ireland and South Africa, was that in the case of Colombia, we first agreed to a framework agreement, which we negotiated in secret, which had the kind of basic framework, the items of the agenda, the objective. And then we only went public when we had those basic understandings that we then fleshed out into a full agreement. And in some ways, that structure set the parameters, but already kind of set the contours of the agreement. And that made everything much easier. In Northern Ireland, there was something less complex, but quite similar with the heads of agreement that was published in January of '98, which already contained the British commitment to the principle of, I just forgot the word, sorry, that there had to be, all citizens of the island of Ireland had to agree on this, and that would be the ultimate source of legitimacy of any agreement. In South Africa, they had a similar thing in '92 with something they called just forgot the resolution negotiations or something like this. When everything was blocked, they agreed on the two of these things that would unblock it, such as, okay, we're going to have a constitution, but we're also going to have a government of national unity, and based on this understanding, we can move forward. So I think you need to really work on those basic understandings first and flesh them out. Because once the real negotiation gets going, get tied, as Ozdil said, in all the deep technical details, and then you can easily sort of lose sight of what's actually going to make it happen. And finally, very quickly, the obvious issue of inclusion. The one point I will make is that it's very easy to say inclusion, but it's quite hard to actually design the process that is truly inclusive. In our case, we went for something I call incremental inclusion, which was that the more it moved forward, the more inclusive it was. But actually, when the negotiation table was working, we had the UN and a major university organize major conferences, so people would send their proposals to the negotiating table and so forth. We created a special commission for women to come and have a look at, and gender to have a look at what we're agreeing, a special commission for ethnic groups, and so forth. So it is possible to do this. And it was even more important, and I will finish with this, in the case of Northern Ireland, where the basis and the big difference to what had happened before was the fact that all parties were at the table. So again, everyone pays lip service to inclusion, but you really have to do it, and you have to think of how you do it in a way which works and makes the negotiation efficient.
Thank you very much to both of you, Marie-Joelle and Sergio, and to all our on-site speakers for the first round of questions. If I can very briefly summarize, I think seems to be a consensus that we need an inclusive process involving civil society, involving women. We need to give incentives to all stakeholders, to both communities, and definitely nothing can be done without the necessary political will. Now we'll move to the second round of questions. I will kindly ask all our speakers on site and online to limit themselves to 3 minutes this time. And the question is, how does the negotiation design impact on the content and outcome, hopefully the success of the negotiations? May I now first give the floor to Ahmet?
Thank you so much. Let me say that what we should keep in mind in the negotiation design is this careful balance between the internal dynamics and the external dynamics. We should not kid each other that a truly Cypriot-owned, Cypriot-led process will succeed, because we had such fantasies in the past and we started it there. So I think that a new negotiation design requires a careful calibration of internal and external factors by starting with the UN Secretary General, who has a very restricted, limited mission, which is this good offices. But I think that just like producing non-papers, the Secretary General should produce what I call non-prerequisites and voice them behind closed doors to all related parties, including the two leaders as well as the other important parties. These prerequisites should be like limited period for negotiations, not open-ended negotiations of things of that sort. Now, I know that I have a lot to say, but I have to just touch upon important points. The realities of today, especially internal dynamics, meaning the two leadership, they are not ready. So what I have in mind is the external dynamics, like the regional developments, and especially energy is the new factor, I think. And when I say energy, it shouldn't just be considered natural gas, but energy in the wider sense, meaning including renewables, that we need technical people to start discussing what will be the policies of the island of Cyprus for energy in the future. Now, two paths. Path one, if there is no starting or resumption of official talks, energy could be an area where we can start cooperating and everybody can benefit from it, all right? And I have two formula for that, bringing in the energy, the technical people to talk, and the other one is engagement without recognition. And you know what I meant by that, okay? Now, the second, if let's say there was a heavyweight UN envoy involved, somebody like Amos Hochstein, who was the architect of this Lebanese-Israeli deal, and I think that that's fantastic. We can learn a lot from it. If a Crans-Montana-style negotiations start, I think this time we should have 3 tables. Last time we had 2 tables. Table 1 for internal affairs, internal issues. Second table was on security. This time we need to add another table.
Under your isolated, unrecognized state. So there will be a real consequence to them as well. If we manage to structure the new negotiation process in such clear format, then I think we will get a resolution to the Cyprus problem. I believe such an approach will also enable the outside players, like Ahmet said, to be more enthusiastically involved and in support of a solution and of a process, because the prospects of a solution will become a realistic prospect. So I believe from now on, this is the main challenge. How do we go about convincing the leaderships that there is a way out, but are they ready to go down that path or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ozdil. And now, Erato.
Thank you, Ari. I already positioned myself regarding the deadlines. I'm not going to repeat. Now, I want to bring another aspect which we have not discussed so far. As we all know, there are 2 aspects of the Cyprus problem, the internal aspect and the external aspect. In the internal aspect, where we are discussing the 4 main governance, property, and so on issues, this is an intercommunal process. On the other external aspects, guarantees and security, we have also the participation of the guarantor powers. So this is not only a bicommunal process, it's a multi-party process. And we have to take this into account in the design process. And why am I saying that? Because there are multiple interests of all those parties. So we have to balance those interests. And also we have to induce incentives to all players, both the two leaders, and I would agree with what Kjartan said earlier regarding the EU and the Turkish Cypriots. I think we can from now find ways to induce incentives for the Turkish Cypriots having certain benefits from the EU. But also, I mentioned the EU. The EU has played a very important role in the negotiations as an observer, overseeing that everything we have agreed is in harmony with the acquis communautaire. But also, I think they can play a very important role with regard to incentives for the guarantors, and primarily for Turkey. So I'm bringing also the issue of energy. I think this is a very important incentive for Turkey. So we should find ways to induce interest for Turkey in this specific area, combining, of course, energy with Turkey's positive involvement in the negotiations. Also, EU membership for Turkey and other EU-Turkey relations is another area where the EU could play an important role during the negotiations. Of course, if and when we agree, we have an agreement, and I want to give this sense of hope. Definitely, we need to design an implementation mechanism. This is very important. The Secretary General made some moves during the negotiations for the implementation mechanism. So this has to be in place. And finally, regarding the referenda, because we need people to vote yes in the new agreement, we need to involve leaders. And I would propose that leaders go jointly out to the people, not each leader to its own community, to convince people that this agreement is an agreement that they should have vote for. I just wanted to bring this multi-party aspect, which is very important. It's very serious, and we have to tackle this in the new process design. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erato. And Kjartan?
So I would maybe just briefly build on what I finished on. So basically, I think that we need to be braver. We need to be willing to take more calculated risks and find these areas I mentioned with one example, but we're quite frankly convinced that there are many other examples where we could offer those concrete benefits and obligations and requirements today. Green line trade, for instance, is an opportunity that is not being used enough, and I think that we have an obligation to try and make this a bit more intensive, so that there is these immediate economic benefits now. And I think it builds confidence that it's possible as well. This is not a small issue. It's not just about the economic benefits, but that you can actually see that it's feasible to work together on concrete things. So all of the things you mentioned is still about the plethora of rules and things you have already defined. You can actually start seeing that, well, it's not just theory. Now, Erato, you mentioned again the EU, and you very rightly said that the role of the EU is to ensure that the EU rules and regulations, so the acquis communautaire, are not going to be violated by agreement. This is obviously because Cyprus is a member state, and a united Cyprus should remain a member state. So this is unfortunately something that is not always fully understood. by all stakeholders in the process. And I think that this is one important change since the beginning of the conflict that would need to be better reflected in the design of the process. I like very much what was said from our online panel, that it's not important to talk about tables. Yet there was a lot of talk about tables running up to Crans-Montana, and I think that really doesn't matter. The point is there an effective mechanism where you can check that things are being controlled and in line with the acquis? Now, there is a second aspect of why the EU needs to have a role, and that it has nothing to do with compliance as such, but this is more that the EU has its own interest. The EU has one very big interest, namely to ensure that, and forgive my language, but nobody would want to see another Bosnia. Bosnia is, I think, I've lived there, so I can say this without offending anybody. It's a pretty failed state and a very weak state, and you don't want to create another Bosnia. So I think it's important that everybody also recognizes the sign here that you can't have any agreement if that agreement renders the unified Cyprus dysfunctional, unable to take decisions at the EU level. Now, I'm not saying this for anybody to use this as an excuse for making any agreements, because the EU is very flexible and there's a lot of room for finding those agreements. I'm just saying that it's important, and I don't think it is fully reflected in the design as is, and I would suggest that this is something that is being considered more explicitly. There are some who say the EU needs to do this and that to earn a right at the table. I always say that, well, we will be there one way or the other, either directly or afterwards, but there won't be any agreement unless the EU would have had a say in whether this is okay or not. So I think if we could be a bit more constructive about this and actually use the opportunity, and then I'll finish, because you mentioned the guarantors and in particular incentives for Turkey. I think the Secretary General of the UN, he recognized in Crans-Montana that the issue of effective participation or effective involvement of Turkey had been largely solved, in part thanks to the EU. So I think that EU is a constraint, but it's also an opportunity. Instead of having very wide disagreement on something, then sometimes the EU brings this level of disagreement much less. Because in fact, if it needs to stay within the EU parameters, we don't have unlimited opportunity. So again, this is a design, I wouldn't call it a flaw, but maybe something that should be reflected better in the future.
Thank you very much, Kjartan. And now give the floor back to our two online panelists, starting from Sergio. Same question, how does the design of the negotiation process affect the outcome and hopefully the success of the negotiations?
Thank you again. I said at the beginning that I thought that a successful process needed two things: a very well thought through structure and design of the process itself, but also work on favorable conditions. And now to end, I'd like to say a few more words about this issue of conditions. You all know, and I think it was used in Cyprus often enough, the famous line that the stars are aligned. But as I think Helmut Kohl said in his book about German unification, that's a fine phrase, but somebody has to align them. And so you really need to think, okay, what kind of things can we work on? And I'll just give you three examples from our own experience very quickly in 2 minutes. The first is the obvious issue, which is so important in Cyprus, of the whole international environment. In the case of Colombia in 2010, we had this really favorable circumstance that there were a number of left-wing governments in Latin America, which made the armed struggle of the FARC look ever more obsolete. But at the same time, there was a lot of mistrust towards Colombia because we've been running this successful security campaign against them. So when President Santos, who had been Minister of Defense, I was actually one of his deputies, became president, the first thing he had to do was change that equation and move our neighbors from being, as the cliche goes, part of the problem, being part of the solution. So the first thing he did, literally 3 days after becoming president, was inviting President Chavez over to Colombia and saying, look, I'm now your neighbor, your president of Colombia. How are we going to work because we have to behave like adults. And then slowly started developing a relation with him. I was actually his secret envoy to go and breach showers and all the things. So we actually brought him into the process. So this would be the equivalent. I'm making this up, but if the Greek Cyprus president gets on a plane and goes to Ankara and talks to Erdogan and says, "Look, we need to sort this out, or at least we want a different relationship with Turkey and with Turkish Cyprus. What can we do?" This kind of thing, it really makes a huge difference. And was without that, the Colombian process would not have worked. And what one sees in the world is that things are moving. Obviously, you're very close to. I work myself quite a lot on Ukraine. You're quite close to everything that's happening there. All the pieces are moving in the world at the moment. At the same time, the discussion of EU expansion is again on the table. How can the Cyprus conflict profit from this and see it as opportunities rather than obstacles? Number two, very quickly, perhaps the biggest innovation in the case of Colombia was to bring the issue of the victims right on the negotiation agenda. I know that in Cyprus, there's a big discussion around property, but when I was there, I thought, perhaps we could go beyond this, because what we found ourselves was that by involving the victims, first by actually having a law of reparations even before we started to talk about, to have a negotiation. So we gave victims guarantees about reparations before we started talking to FARC. But then when we started talking, we actually invited them to the negotiating table, and we listened to them for over 3 months. Delegations of 12 would come and talk about, and the really surprising and interesting and relevant effect is that even though there were victims of all kinds of different armed groups and also of our own military, they in the end discovered that what they had in common was much more than what made them different. And so these stories and actually listening to each other was very powerful. And I've often thought that in places like Cyprus and the Middle East, opening space for people to listen to each other about what happened to them is really a powerful fuel for change. And then finally, the issue that everyone's been mentioning, which is the biggest issue in Cyprus, I should think, is the issue of the politics. How do you align the politics with the strategic objective of peace? I have this observation that solving long conflicts is very difficult, but it's much more difficult in a democracy, because in democracies that have conflicts, or as the people in Northern Ireland say, conflicted democracies, is end up being part and parcel of politics and makes everything very difficult. The case of Israel is a very obvious one. So what can you do about that? Well, I think that what you're doing with the Cyprus Forum is extremely important, to have an open discussion about ideas, to be moving things, not to stay put. But in the end, the challenge does remain in Cyprus, and I think Ozdil was addressing this, of how do you create a situation where people really have to face a choice? This is a problem, because in our case, at least, it was okay. We can have no negotiation, but we have this war that goes on. In the case of Northern Ireland, everyone knew that negotiation would also bring an end to the terrorist campaign of IRA. In South Africa, the unsustainable situation of apartheid and so forth. But in Cyprus, as you know far better than I do, it seems that to many people, perhaps most people, the status quo is probably preferable to trying anything else. So how do you structure that choice? What needs to happen so that people feel really this is the moment to end this? That's a challenge, I should think.
So much, Sergio. And last but not least, Marie-Joelle, same question to you. How does the design affect?
I'm gonna be brief, in part because we are already over time, but also because Sergio stole my thunder. That's great. Because I wanted to say that we should not be thinking about how negotiation design helps the outcome. We should be thinking about how negotiation design is actually catering to the difficulties that we know have prevented success in the past. And I'm no Cyprus expert, even though I grew up across the Mediterranean and Lebanon, and I know something about protracted conflicts. But I think that listening to you, there are things that you've already identified, a design that actually takes into account both the intercommunal and the multi-party issues, a design that actually addresses the lack of trust that has developed between the parties because of problems with political will at the last minute, and a design that balances all of that with some transparency towards publics so that you can bring the publics along, because ultimately, no matter who is sitting in the negotiations unless the publics are actually on board. The best agreement has actually feet of clay. So I won't go into more detail, but I think that you already know the principles. The difficulty has always been, how do you translate them into practice?
Much also for being brief at the end, because we have indeed run out of our time. I would like to thank all our on-site and online speakers for their very insightful comments. I think you can all agree that this was perhaps the most insightful discussion on the Cyprus problem we have had for quite some time. I do hope that decision makers in both sides do listen and take into consideration what has been said and discussed. I would like to, unfortunately, we do not have a time for any interaction with the audience, but I guess that in the short break, there can be this opportunity. So thank you, everybody, for being here, for attending this. Thank you again, Sergio and Marie-Joelle, for being with us, for joining us online. And yeah, thank you.